2,000 years ago, under the suffocating weight of the Pax Romana, a marginalized tradesman from a backwater village executed the most successful organizational disruption in human history. By examining the archaeological grid of Galilee and the Aramaic nuances of his strategy, we uncover a masterclass in high-stakes leadership that bypassed the Sanhedrin and outlasted the very empire that sought to erase him. If you ran the data on the first century, the probability of us sitting here discussing a peasant from Galilee today is statistically zero. Consider the competitive landscape of the year 30 AD. The Mediterranean world was held in the suffocating grip of the... To the modern ear, that sounds like a time of tranquility. To a historian, it translates to peace through superior firepower. Rome didn't just conquer nations, it erased them. They had a sophisticated bureaucracy, the world's most lethal standing army, and a taxation system that bled provinces dry to feed the capital. In the eastern fringe of this empire lay Judea, a political powder keg. Here, the local governance, the Sanhedrin, operated on a razor's edge. They were tasked with a near impossible KPIs: maintain religious order among a zealous population while keeping the Roman legions from burning Jerusalem to the ground. They knew that one spark of rebellion would result in total annihilation. Into this hyper-tense, highly regulated market steps a day laborer named Jesus. He has no political office, he holds no wealth, he commands no soldiers, he speaks Aramaic, a language of the working poor, not the Latin of power or the Greek of the academy. His operational budget is non-existent. And yet, he begins to dismantle the status quo. Now, here is the shocking reality that often gets lost in Sunday school paintings. Jesus was not unique in claiming to be a Messiah. History is littered with the names of charismatic leaders from this era. Simon of Perea, Athronges the shepherd. They raised armies, they promised liberation, and they were all brutally crushed. Crucifixion, the method of Jesus' execution, wasn't a special event reserved for the Son of God. It was an industrial tool of state terror. It was Rome's way of turning human bodies into billboards that read, "Do not challenge the system." Thousands of Jewish men were crucified in this era. Their movements died the moment their hearts stopped beating. By every metric available to a historian, the Jesus movement should have vanished within weeks of his death. The data suggests his followers should have dispersed, his name should have been forgotten, and the empire should have rolled on uninterrupted. But that didn't happen. Instead, this itinerant rabbi executed a strategy of asymmetric influence so profound that 3 centuries later, the emperor of Rome bowed to the carpenter from Nazareth. So, put aside the stained glass for a moment. Whether you are a believer or a skeptic, we have to ask the practical question: how? How do you lead a revolution that outlasts an empire without firing a single shot? How do you build an organization that scales for 2,000 years when your entire executive team is executed? We are going to look at the historical mechanics of the most unlikely success story in human history. To understand the disruption, you first have to understand the market conditions. Before we can talk about the man, Jesus of Nazareth, or Yeshua, as his neighbors in the dusty hills of Galilee would have called him, we must analyze the machine he stepped into. History is often painted in broad, romantic strokes, but the reality of first-century Judea was gritty, lethal, and dangerously complex. Imagine a powder keg where the fuse is always lit. This is the world of 4 BC to 30 AD. If you were a strategic consultant looking at this region on a map, you would see a logistical nightmare. Israel is a land bridge. It connects Africa, Asia, and Europe. Everyone wants it, not for the resources, but for the roads. Control the bridge and you control the trade. And in this era, the landlord is the Roman Empire. We often hear the term, the Roman peace. It sounds idyllic, almost utopian. But let's deconstruct that data. For a Roman citizen in Italy, yes, it meant stability. But for a Jewish peasant in Galilee, there was not peace, it was pacification. It was peace at the end of a sword. It was the quiet of a room where everyone is terrified to speak. Rome operated on a brutal, efficient algorithm: extraction and order. They demanded tribute to feed the engine of the empire. The tax burden was crushing. You have the Roman land tax, the poll tax, customs duties, and then, on top of that, the religious tithes required by local law. The average family was operating at a massive deficit, engaged in subsistence survival. This creates the first layer of our context, economic desperation. When people have nothing to lose, they become unpredictable. Now, look at the management structure. Rome didn't like to micromanage every province directly if they didn't have to. They preferred a client-state model. In Judea, this meant a complex, high-stakes political dance. You have the Roman prefect, men like Pontius Pilate, who are essentially middle managers sent to a hardship post. Their KPI is simple: keep the grain flowing and keep the rebels quiet. If a riot breaks out, Rome sends the legions, and the prefect loses his job, or his head. Beneath the Roman overlay, you have the local power structure, the Sanhedrin. Think of the Sanhedrin not just as a religious council, but as the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the City Council rolled into one. Composed largely of the aristocratic Sadducees and the legalistic Pharisees, they are the guardians of the status quo. They are in an impossible position. They are trying to preserve their cultural identity and their temple, the economic and spiritual heart of the nation, while standing in the shadow of the Roman eagle. They know the math. If they push Rome too hard, Jerusalem burns. If they capitulate too much, the people revolt. They are walking a razor's wire, practicing the ultimate form of political triangulation. Then, there's the culture on the ground. The language of the streets is Aramaic, a Semitic tongue related to Hebrew. The language of commerce is Greek. The language of the law is Latin. It is a polyglot, cosmopolitan pressure cooker. But the most important data point to understand is the psychological state of the populace. The atmosphere was apocalyptic. We see this in the historical texts and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The people weren't just unhappy, they were waiting. They were anticipating a Messiah. But here's where modern audiences get it wrong. They weren't waiting for a spiritual guru to teach them mindfulness. They were waiting for a general. They wanted a hammer. They wanted a second King David to drive the Romans into the sea and restore sovereignty. There had been failed insurrections before. Bandits and charismatic leaders would rise up, gather a following in the desert, and be ruthlessly crushed by Roman cavalry. Crucifixion was not a rare theological symbol then. It was a billboard. It was Rome's public service announcement along the highways. This is the chaotic marketplace into which Jesus emerges. He comes from Galilee, the northern region. In the eyes of the Jerusalem elites, the members of the Sanhedrin, Galilee is flyover country. It's rural, agricultural, and filled with accents that sound uneducated to the city ear. Nothing of importance is supposed to come from there. So when we look at the rise of Jesus, we have to look at it through the lens of leadership strategy. How do you deuce a new paradigm in a market dominated by a monopoly and regulated by a fierce incumbency? Most leaders in this situation choose one of two paths. You join the system. You work with the Sanhedrin. You pay your taxes. You keep your head down. You take up the sword. You become a zealot. You fight Rome on Rome's terms, and you inevitably lose because Rome has better scaling and logistics. The genius of the history we are about to explore is that Jesus chooses a third option. He doesn't assimilate, and he doesn't attack frontally. He initiates an asymmetric campaign for the human heart. He ignores the hierarchy and goes directly to the end user, the fisherman, the tax collector, the outcast. As professional leaders, the lesson here is about context awareness. You cannot lead effectively if you do not understand the systems of power operating around you. Jesus understood the Sanhedrin. He knew exactly where the red lines were, and for 3 years he danced right on top of them. He walks into a world defined by walls, between Jew and Gentile, man and woman, clean and unclean. And he doesn't just climb the walls. He dismantles the foundation of why the walls exist. This is the stage. The lighting is harsh, the audience is hostile, and the stakes are life and death. The machine is set to crush anyone who doesn't fit the mold. And out of the northern hills comes a carpenter who decides to change the operating system of the world. Imagine the map of the known world in the year 30 AD. From the mist-covered hills of Britannia to the sands of Egypt, one color dominates: Roman red. This is the the Roman peace. But do not let the name fool you. This wasn't peace born of harmony. It was peace enforced by iron. It was a global corporate structure maintained by the gladius and the cross, where order was the primary currency and dissent was liquidated. In the dusty peripheral province of Judea, the air was thick with static. You have to understand the geopolitical tension here. On one side, you have the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate, a middle management bureaucrat trying to keep a lid on a rebellious population. On the other, you have the Sanhedrin, the supreme council of Jewish leadership. These weren't just religious figures, they were the Supreme Court, the cultural gatekeepers, trying to preserve their identity under the crushing weight of an empire. Into this powder keg walks a construction worker from Nazareth. No army, no political, no wealth. A man speaking Aramaic, a language of the earth, guttural and direct. And yet, within 3 years, this man, Jesus of Nazareth, initiates a movement that will eventually topple the very empire that executed him. How? How does an uncredentialed rabbi outmaneuver the greatest superpower in history? The answer lies in a skill set that every modern leader, CEO, and entrepreneur needs to master: asymmetric communication. Jesus was objectively a master communicator. He understood something about human psychology that we often forget in our boardrooms and Zoom calls. Information doesn't change people, does. Consider his rhetorical strategy. When challenged by the intellectual elite of his day, the Pharisees and Sadducees, he rarely gave a direct answer. A direct answer ends the conversation. A question deepens it. When asked, "Who is my neighbor?" he didn't give a demographic definition. He told the story of the Good Samaritan. This is a masterclass in sticky communication. He bypassed the intellect and aimed for the gut. He used Aramaic idioms and agricultural metaphors, seeds, sheep, vineyards, data points that his audience touched every single day. He anchored high-level abstract concepts to physical reality. For you, the modern professional, the lesson is clear. If you cannot explain your strategy using the equivalent of bread and stone, you don't understand your strategy well enough. Furthermore, look at his use of silence and presence. In the high-stakes environment of his trial before the Sanhedrin and later before Pilate, the records show moments of profound silence. In negotiation theory, we call this a status play. When falsely accused, the instinct is to defend, to babble, to over-explain. That is a beta reaction. Jesus displayed the supreme confidence of someone who did not need to win the argument to win the war. He controlled the frame of the interaction by refusing to play by the opponent's rules. He also mastered the art of the paradoxical invitation. Most leaders lead by outlining the benefits. Follow me and you'll get rich. Jesus inverted the funnel. He said, "Take up your cross." He offered hardship, service, and sacrifice. Counterintuitively, this is what builds elite teams. High performers aren't looking for ease, they are looking for meaning. By demanding everything, he communicated that the mission was worth everything. So we have this itinerant preacher disrupting the status quo through radical communication and servant leadership. The collision was inevitable. The system, the Pax Romana and the Sanhedrin, relied on fear to maintain order. Jesus deuced a variable that the system couldn't process: love that conquers fear. When he rode into Jerusalem, he didn't ride a war horse, he rode a donkey. It was political theater of the highest order. He was mocking the Roman triumph, signaling that his kingdom operated on a completely different operating system. The execution that followed was meant to delete him from history. Crucifixion was the empire's ultimate marketing campaign for fear. It was public, brutal, and humiliating. But because Jesus had spent 3 years embedding his message into the hearts of his followers through stories rather than just laws, the message survived the messenger. When we look at the data, the spread of early Christianity is a statistical anomaly. It grew at a rate of roughly 40% per decade for centuries, despite active persecution. This growth wasn't driven by the sword, but by a compelling counterculture that dignity belonged to everyone, slave and free, male and female. Here is the practical wisdom for you today. You operate in your own version of the Pax Romana: market forces, corporate structures, societal expectations. You face your own Sanhedrins, boards, critics, gatekeepers. Jesus of Nazareth teaches us that true authority isn't seized, it is conferred upon those who serve. He teaches us that the most powerful way to communicate isn't to shout over the noise, but to tell a story so true that the noise fades away. He showed us that if you want to change the world, you don't look at the hierarchy and ask, "How do I climb this?" You look at the people around you and ask, "How do I wash their feet?" That is the paradox of influence. The one who seeks to dominate is eventually forgotten. The one who seeks to serve is remembered forever. History is written by the victors, they say. But in this case, history was rewritten by the victim who turned the world upside down, simply by speaking the truth in love. Let's look at the map. If you zoom out to the 1st century, the world is dominated by a single monolithic operating system, the Roman Empire. From the rainy moors of England to the hot sands of Syria, Rome is the brand. They have achieved the Roman peace. But do not mistake peace for tranquility. This was peace at the end of a gladius. It was peace through superior firepower, logistics, and engineering. It was a world built on hierarchy, patronage, and the absolute crushing of dissent. In the Roman value system, might makes right. Mercy is a weakness, the gods far the strong. If you are poor, if you are sick, if you are marginalized, it is because you lack strength. Now, zoom into the edge of the map, a rocky, dusty province called Judea. It is a powder keg of insurrection, religious zealotry, and heavy taxation. And there, in a region called Galilee, specifically a village called Nazareth, which had a population of maybe 400 people, we find a young man. He isn't a general. He isn't a senator. He possesses no army, no political capital, and no wealth. He is a TT. We translate that as carpenter, but it really means a builder, a day laborer who works with stone and wood. He speaks Aramaic, the language of the working class, with a heavy rural accent. If you ran his profile through a predictive algorithm in the year 28 AD, the probability of him being remembered 2,000 years later would be 0. And yet, this man, Jesus of Nazareth, is about to execute the most successful disruptive startup in human history. How? He didn't do it by fighting Rome on Rome's terms. He didn't try to outmuscle the legions. He did something far more dangerous. He hacked the source code of Western civilization. He induced a moral revolution. To understand this revolution, you have to look at the data of his teachings. It wasn't just religious, it was a total inversion of leadership dynamics. Picture the scene. He sits on a hillside. This is the Sermon on the Mount. In the corporate world, this is the keynote, the mission statement. The crowd expects a call to arms. They expect him to say, "Blessed are the strong, for they shall retake Jerusalem." Instead, he drops a bomb. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers." This is absurd to the Roman mind. It is absurd to the zealot mind, but Jesus is dosing a new physics of power. In Rome, power flows from the top down. Caesar commands, the Senate legislates, the legions enforce, the people obey. Jesus flips the pyramid. He argues that true power flows from the bottom up, through service, through sacrifice, and through radical empathy. This is the concept of, in Greek there are several words for love, is desire, is friendship. But that is a decision. It is unconditional, sacrificial goodwill toward another, regardless of their status. Jesus operationalizes. He tells his followers to turn the other cheek. Now, historically, we've misunderstood this as passivity. It is not. In that culture, if a superior slapped a subordinate, it was with the back of the hand, a gesture of dismissal. To turn the other cheek forced the aggressor to strike with an open palm or a fist, creating a moment of equality, a challenge to their dignity. It was a form of nonviolent resistance that stripped the oppressor of their moral authority. This is high-level emotional intelligence applied to systemic oppression. He is teaching them how to dismantle an empire without drawing a sword. But this disruption creates friction. Great leadership always does. And Jesus found himself squeezed between two massive incumbent powers. On one side, you have the Roman administration, represented by Pontius Pilate. Pilate is a middle management bureaucrat trying to keep his quarterly numbers up, meaning tax revenue and zero riots. He doesn't care about theology, he cares about order. On the other side, you have the Sanhedrin. This is the Supreme Court and the Senate of the Jewish people combined. These are the keepers of the law, the tradition, the status quo. They are wealthy, educated, and powerful. Jesus threatens the Sanhedrin not because he breaks the law, though they accuse him of that, but because he bypasses their gatekeeping. When he heals a leper, or eats with a tax collector, or speaks to a Samaritan woman, he is democratizing access to the divine. He is saying, you don't need the institution to find value. You have intrinsic value because you are human. In the ancient world, human rights did not exist. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you were property. Jesus deuces the radical idea that the individual, regardless of class, gender, or ethnicity, has infinite worth. This is the seed of modern democracy, of human rights, of the very concept of the individual in Western thought. Let's talk about the crisis management. The climax of his is the passion. From a leadership perspective, look at the Last Supper. He knows there is a leak in his organization, Judas. He knows the hostile takeover is imminent. What does he do? He strips off his outer robe and washes the feet of his disciples. In that context, foot washing was the job of the lowest slave. Peter, his right-hand man, is horrified. He says, "You shall never wash my feet. It's a violation of protocol." But Jesus is establishing the culture that will survive him. He is saying, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, but not so with you. He defines leadership not by how many people serve you, but by how many people you serve. This is servant leadership, 2,000 years before management textbooks coined the term. He is building a culture of high trust and high sacrifice. When the arrest comes, the collision of these value systems is stark. He stands before Pilate. Pilate asks, "Are you a king?" Jesus answers, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate cannot process this. He deals in territory, borders, and tax brackets. Jesus is dealing in hearts, minds, and eternal principles. Pilate has the authority to kill him, but he has no power to control him. That is a crucial distinction for any leader. Authority is given. Power is generated. The execution, the crucifixion, was designed by Rome to be the ultimate marketing campaign for fear. It was a billboard saying, "This is what happens when you challenge the system." It was meant to erase him. But here is the historical anomaly. Usually, when a messianic leader is killed, the movement dissolves, the followers scatter, the ideology dies. In this case, the opposite happened. The movement exploded. Within a few decades, this message of radical love, this good news, had infiltrated the very household of Caesar. Why? Because the product was superior. The Roman system offered order, but it cost you your freedom. The Sanhedrin offered tradition, but it cost you your access. Jesus offered a new identity. He offered a way to be in the world, but not defined by the brutal metrics of the world. So what is the takeaway for you? You are leaders. You are building companies, teams, legacies. First, look at your metrics of success. Are you playing the Roman game, accumulation, dominance, status? That game has a shelf life. Rome fell. Or are you playing the long game, the game of value creation, of empowering others, of building a culture that can survive without your constant presence? Second, consider the power of the moral revolution. Innovation isn't just about technology, it's about behavior. If you want to disrupt your industry, don't just build a better widget. Build a better way of treating people, radical transparency, radical generosity. In a transactional world, transformational relationships are the ultimate competitive advantage. Jesus of Nazareth never traveled more than a few hundred miles from his birthplace. He never wrote a book. He never held office. Yet, by inverting the pyramid of power and anchoring leadership in service and sacrifice, he split history into before and after. He showed us that the softest things in the world, mercy, humility, love, are actually the hardest things. They are the only things that endure when the statues crumble and the empires fade. That is a history lesson worth mastering. Imagine for a moment that you are standing on the edge of the Roman Empire. It is the 1st century. The air is thick with dust and the metallic tang of oppression. We tend to view this era through the soft focus of stained glass, but history tells us something far grittier. This was the era of the peace of Rome. But let's be clear about what that peace meant. It wasn't tranquility. It was the enforced silence achieved through brutal military infrastructure. In this context, Judea is not a holy land. It is a powder keg. It is a rebellious province crushed under heavy taxation and the constant threat of the legionnaire's spear. Into this latile geopolitical landscape walks a man from a village so insignificant that colloquial jokes were made about its irrelevance. Nazareth. Jesus. A builder, a day laborer. He has no credentials, no wealth, and no army. He speaks Aramaic, the rough dialect of the working class, not the polished Greek of the philosophers or the Latin of the conquerors. And yet, within 3 years, he will dismantle the moral architecture of the Western world. How? How does a peasant artisan effectively hack the operating system of the most powerful empire in human history? To understand his impact, we have to look at the power structures he navigated. You had Rome, the totalitarian state, holding the sword. Then you had the Sanhedrin, the supreme religious council in Jerusalem. Think of the Sanhedrin as a high-stakes board of directors trying to manage a hostile takeover. Their primary goal was survival. They had to maintain religious order to keep Rome from burning the temple down. It was a delicate, high-pressure balancing act. Jesus enters this tension not with a sword, but with a story. Historically, his genius lay in what we might call asymmetric leadership. Rome led through coercion, Jesus led through invitation. The Sanhedrin led through exclusion, purity laws, and social stratification. Jesus led through radical inclusion. He recruited a core team that was a logistical nightmare. He mixed zealots, revolutionaries who wanted to kill Romans, with tax collectors who were essentially collaborators funding the Roman occupation. In a modern boardroom, HR would tell you this team is a liability. But Jesus understood that if you can unify people who hate each other around a shared vision, you create an unbreakable culture. He operated in the margins. He bypassed the power centers of Jerusalem and took his message to the hillsides of Galilee. He used parables, short, punchy S, to bypass the defensive intellect of his listeners. A parable is a data compression tool. It takes complex ethical philosophy and packs it into a story about a farmer or a mustard seed. It makes the idea viral. But the true disruption was his redefinition of power. In the first century, as in much of the 21st, power was defined by how many people served you. Jesus inverted the pyramid. He washed feet. He ate with social pariahs. He deuced the concept of servant leadership 2,000 years before it became a buzzword in business schools. This, inevitably, caused friction. The system cannot tolerate a variable it cannot control. To the Sanhedrin, Jesus was a chaotic element threatening the fragile peace with Rome. To Rome, he was just another potential insurrectionist. The collision was mathematical inevitability. When he stood before Pilate, and later when he faced execution, he displayed a level of emotional regulation that is historically staggering. In a shame-honor culture, the goal of crucifixion was not just death, it was public humiliation. It was designed to erase your legacy. Yet, by refusing to engage in the cycle of violence, by forgiving his executioners while the nails were driven in, he broke the psychological power of the oppressor. He turned a symbol of state terror, the cross, into a symbol of universal hope. So what does this mean for you? You are likely not walking the dusty roads of Galilee, but you are navigating complex hierarchies. You are dealing with your own versions of the Sanhedrin, rigid systems, gatekeepers, and office politics. You are living under the pressure of quarterly earnings and market demands, your own. There are 3 critical leadership takeaways from the life of the Nazarene that apply directly to the modern professional. First, most leaders hire for comfort. They want people who think like them. Great leaders hire for friction. Jesus built a team of rivals. If your inner circle only nods at your ideas, you aren't leading, you're echoing. You need to bridge divides in your organization to create something resilient. Second, you cannot lead with spreadsheets alone. Data informs, but stories compel. Jesus changed the world because he was a master storyteller. If you want to drive culture change in your company, stop sending memos and start telling stories that embody the values you want to see. And finally, we often think leadership is about ascending, getting the corner office, the equity. But enduring influence comes from descending. It comes from removing obstacles for your team, from taking the blame when things go wrong, and giving away the credit when they go right. Jesus of Nazareth proved that you don't need it to lead. You don't need authority to have influence. You simply need the courage to serve others in a world that tells you to serve yourself. That is the only legacy that survives the empire.